Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Progressive American Report. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Greta Uehling from the University of Michigan. She is a cultural anthropologist specializing in the study of war, conflict, and population displacement. She is the author of Beyond Memory, The Deportation and Repatriation of the Crimean Tatars and Everyday War, The Conflict over Donbass, Ukraine. Today we are discussing her new book, Decolonizing Ukraine, The Indigenous People of Crimea and Pathways to Freedom. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Uehling.
Happy to be here.
So I want to just start off with the general context for how this book started out. What were some of the considerations that went into writing the book? What were some of the concerns that you had about how it would be received? And what were some of the challenges that you had by going to Ukraine and Crimea specifically?
Some of the key protagonists in the book are members of Ukraine's largest indigenous group, the Crimean Tatars, and I've actually been working with them since the late 90s. So as a result of this ongoing research, I was acutely aware that the literature about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine often overlooks their experience, even though they are among some of the most affected by the illegal annexation. And so, as your listeners may or may not know, for centuries they comprised the vast majority of the population on the population of Crimea. And so, while the world has been focused on the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this book takes readers back to the war's inception with the occupation of Crimea. And I delve into the experiences of the people who were actually there when Russia colonized or recolonized Crimea, some of whom fled for government-controlled Ukraine. And so I think what their stories show is how the Russian operation dispossessed them of their dreamed of futures, but also how these losses became a catalyst for finding a new way to be Ukrainian and embracing values, common Ukrainian values. And so it's really, as a whole, a story of, their striking resilience.
I think one of the things that is especially interesting to me about this book is not just the fact that this is about the war in Ukraine, but it's specifically focusing on how identity has evolved. And recently, Vladimir Putin has made some rather interesting comments about Ukrainian identity, namely that he claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same. How do narratives like that from the Russian government influence not only how the Crimean Tatars view themselves, but also how they basically fight for their own future in the larger conflict?
What you're describing reminds me of a woman who left Crimea after it was occupied, and she told me how the Russian authorities there tried to make her accept a Russian passport.
Mm.
And she said, "No, I'm fine with my Ukrainian passport. I don't want a Russian passport." And they said, "Ukraine, that state doesn't even exist," right? And so I think that these comments are an example of the kind of epistemic violence, right? Telling a people that they don't exist as a people, telling a state that it's not real, is a kind of epistemic violence that is exactly what Ukraine is trying to free itself from in over the past decade, right? Like, this is exactly what Ukrainians are fighting for, which is the freedom to disentangle themselves from Russian political, cultural, linguistic, economic dominance so that they can enjoy the lives as they see fit.
Yeah, and I think the thing that strikes me as particularly galling is later in that on the Reuters article I was reading to get a sense of these comments was that he said something to the effect of when a Russian soldier steps foot on a location that is ours. There is this overarching imperialistic arrogance that I think is especially frustrating. And I was wondering, how has Russia's relationship with historical narratives surrounding Ukraine and the Crimean Tatars influenced their propaganda? How have people reacted to it? And how have they resisted it?
Mm-hmm. Well, Ukrainians are resisting by um, rethinking their regional history and essentially diving deep into primary sources to reconceptualize the Russocentric narratives in ways that they believe are more historically accurate, right? That's the big problem with Russian historical propaganda, is that it's designed to um, have people believe one thing that may or may not be true. So the resistance to it is really there's a lot of historical resistance to these historical, confabulations, exaggerations, um, outright invention. And so I don't think that, like, for Crimean Tatars in particular are very familiar with the ways in which Russian historical narratives attempt to erase their history on the peninsula as part of a larger project of claiming that they're there for legitimate reasons. And so
Mm.
um, Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians are not going to be drawn in or confused by that. They are going to shrug and go on with um, the important work that they have to do in terms of pushing back Russian aggression.
And I also kind of think that there's a concerning thing from the perspective of people on the outside who are kind of falling for this misinformation as well. One of the things that has always kind of struck me over the last several years is how blatant Russian misinformation spreads, how blatant and upfront they are with their nonsense. And I'm wondering, when you were on the ground with some of these people, what were they saying about some of the ways in which Westerners, people in the United States, viewed them and their history, and how did that impact not just how you wrote the book, but also how you interacted with these people day to day?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's true that it's frustrating, and I think it's important for people who don't have a lot of experience with the way that Russia operates to understand that Russia controls people as much by shaping how they think as through military means.
Mm.
They're both important, and the um, some of these narratives are very sophisticated. And I think that that's why people who aren't familiar with Russian history or Russian influence in the Eastern European region are likely to be drawn in. And I think really something that's very crucial to do is to study history, right? Like this whole one of the biggest myths is that Crimea is historically Russian, and somehow, um, perhaps by repeating it often enough, it came to be true, right? That was something that my informants warned me about, like this old um, uh, truth that if you repeat something often enough, people will start to think that it's true. So it's crucially important to realize that Crimea is not historically Russian, that its influence, dates back to the 1850s, really after, I mean, obviously it colonized in 1783, but there was really only an appreciable Russian presence there um, much later. And so I think that that is really the main thing with regard to these historical narratives.
Uh,
The only other thing I would say in that regard is that Russia has inaugurated something that it calls patriotic education, which has to do with the way that um, children are educated in the schools about history. And this will, once this will be a really difficult thing to unwind, right? Because young people going through years and years of schooling, hearing these narratives will be difficult to, persuade otherwise.
That kind of reminds me of like the lost cause in the United States with when it comes to like how these myths were specifically targeted towards children. And that was something I really wish I had considered beforehand. How has like Russia specifically targeted children when it comes to these narratives? What are some of the narratives that they've tried to maintain? What are some of the ways that they've kind of tried to isolate these children from narratives that undermine their propaganda?
You know, one of the something that I've done a lot of research into is the way that this propaganda affects relationships, right? So we know Russia's regime to be hybrid, but one of those hybrid modalities is operates through disrupting relationships. So in other words, a young person in school will be told to monitor their parents' media consumption habits and report back if their parent is consuming pro-Ukrainian content. Right. And so that, like, I'll tell you the story of Elvira, whose son always like relish telling her about his day. But one day she picks him up. He's completely silent. She doesn't know what's going on. He's doesn't seem to want to, he's upset, but he doesn't want to talk about anything. Finally, she coaxes him into talking about what happened that day, which is that um, his school teachers had told him that if his mother was consuming any news coming from government controlled Ukraine, she's a traitor. Right? That's a very strong word. Like, this is not a place where multiple viewpoints can coexist. So he's told that his mother is a traitor, and he decides, given being torn between loyalty to his school, his friends, his future in this town, and his parents, he's torn. And this was among the motivations that led her family to flee. And I can give you many, many different examples, but this has only become more intense over the last decade. Russia has inaugurated a Telegram channel that encourages people to report on their neighbors and their friends who might have said something that's pro-Ukrainian or said something that was even just anti-war, right? And that will be they follow up, and there's punishment for that.
And when I was, admittedly, I was in grad school and I was writing a little bit about the Russo-Ukrainian war. One of the things that was constantly coming up was that protests were very violently and aggressively and publicly suppressed. And it's very, very clear, at least from my perspective, that Russia wanted the world to see that they were not unwilling to use violence against their own citizens to maintain a narrative, and they were willing to do that to people in Crimea and in Ukraine as well. But what role has violence played, not just in Crimea, but in the larger conflict with Ukraine towards civilians? Because obviously they're willing to monitor people's parents through their children. I think that's something that is especially important to talk about because they've been very aggressive towards civilians.
Mhm. Yes, they've been very aggressive towards civilians, and in Russian occupied Crimea, the Crimean Tatars are among the most affected because they're targeted. Russian authorities know that the Crimean Tatars have traditionally been pro-Ukrainian, and so they've become targets for arrest, imprisonment, disappearances. And I think that in order to understand the scope of this, it could be helpful to know that from the perspective of people trying to resist this violence, the contemporary Russian authorities are worse than the Soviets. It's worse than in the Soviet Union, precisely because, like in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of censorship, but in today's occupied Crimea, people are being, literally swept off the streets, swept from their homes. There's home searches, searches of mosques, searches of schools. People are apprehended. Sometimes they don't come back. Sometimes they're tortured. Oftentimes, if they are put into a prison, it's far away from the peninsula where their relatives can't support them or monitor their well-being.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've been trying to kind of warn people about isn't just that this is a major war on in terms of its scale, but in its inhumanity. One of the things you also mentioned in your book is that, and you mentioned it a little bit in this interview, is that the Russian invasion, both in 2014 and in 2022, is part of a settler colonial project. How has Russia really tried to? Have they really tried to hide that as their intention, or have they more attempted to basically try and say that might makes right alone. And how have Crimean Tartars kind of pushed back on that, and how have they managed to gain some success in reaction to this aggression?
Mhm. It's certainly not hidden, and it's like a defining feature of the settler colonial project is that not only does the power seek to extract resources or benefit economically from controlling a particular area, but it also seeks to replace the existing population with its own. And we see that in Crimea over a long durée. It began with the Russian imperial colonization of Crimea in the 18th century, when the indigenous population was dispossessed of its property and large numbers left for the Ottoman Empire. It continued during the Crimean War. It reached its apogee with under the Soviet Union when all of the Crimean Tatars were deported in the course of a single night, so that the population, if Crimean Tatars, the indigenous population comprised over 90% at the time that Russia first colonized the peninsula, it went down to zero in 1944, which is um, a war crime. And following that, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, many Crimean Tatars returned. They now comprise about between 12 and 13% of the population of the peninsula. But there's another whole dimension of this project, which is Russia's encouragement for Russians to migrate into the peninsula now, further disrupting that demographic balance in favor of Russia. So in my book, Decolonizing Ukraine, I lay this out in a graph to dramatize the extent to which you have a majority population that goes to a minority, and you have a minority population, namely the Slavic population, that through very deliberate policymaking over centuries becomes a majority. And then that's used as the basis for saying that somehow this is all legitimate, right? When war crimes were committed, the property was taken unlawfully, it was never compensated, there were no reparations, right? So it's not a legitimate project. So that's kind of the encapsulation of a long and obviously much more complex narrative.
It's disturbing to watch because they're so blatant about it, and it's really frustrating to me because there is a subsection of the online left and online right that unfortunately perpetuates this idea that Russia has this historical claim to Crimea, that Ukraine isn't a real country, or in some cases, they attempt to portray NATO expansion as the basis for this conflict. And I actually had a debate with a gentleman on the left of the on this issue, and one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize is the fact that there are people who are indigenous, there are people who have lived there in their own right that are continuing to resist. You mentioned in the book that while a large, like tens of thousands of Tartars left the region in the 2 years leading up to this conflict, the majority stayed. What were some of the risks that came with staying? How did they like maintain their culture, history, and institutions in the face of some of this aggression?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And um, they stayed because of the importance of maintaining a position, maintaining a presence on the peninsula, right? Like if everybody left, that would be essentially giving in to what the outcome, right, that Russia is hoping for. So they stayed, and there are many different kinds of cultural resistance, um, um, plays, music, painting, poetry, the arts. I think something that doesn't receive enough attention is humor, right? Like there was this word, Krimnosh, that got used by Crimean Tatars in some very humorous and ironic ways, right? Like this is really bad, but their humor surrounding it was another way of like sustaining their connection to each other and their ability to survive in these inhospitable conditions. Um, in another form of resistance that is also peaceful but more forceful is the Crimean blockade that happened in 2015 and 2016 when Crimean Tatars, together with other Ukrainians, basically donned balaclavas, dragged tires across the roads, and stopped the traffic in goods. And I think that they really exemplify the strategic vision, right? So this is very, very early in the war. They exemplify the strategic vision at a time when most people were, there weren't really a lot of conversations about regaining control of Crimea for Ukraine. And so they had the strategic vision and they had the courage to carry it out. And this is something that I think is really a crucial component and contribution of the indigenous population to the country of Ukraine as a whole, is that they've had enough experience with domination that they have the ability to acknowledge that it could be a very scary and dangerous situation, but that the alternatives to acting are even worse, right? They must act in defense of their interests. And I think that this is really important because it's also an example of a non-expropriative approach to the peninsula, right? They don't view the peninsula as um, a resource. They see it as their responsibility. They see it as their responsibility to care for that land that was historically is theirs, and that, you know, the graves of their ancestors are there. They've occupied it for centuries, and so, you know, like it's their responsibility to care for that vulnerable ecosystem. And I think that too provides um, a vision for Ukraine and the sort of the more moral wherewithal to follow through.
Well, and circling back to 2014, I really do think it's worth noting how fundamentally illegal and blatantly nonsensical the Russian claims were. Because initially they straight up denied that the troops that were speaking Russian, using Russian equipment in Crimea, were actually Russian soldiers. But when this really started, the approach by the Russians, how did they? Geez, I can't talk today. Uh, how did the Crimean Tatars initially react, not just to the claims by the Russians that they had a right to Crimea, but that people willingly wanted to become part of Russia? How did they react to that? How did they push back on that? And how has the role of like language to describe the land influenced their resistance?
Mhm. Well, there's a very famous call that Mustafa Dzhemiliev, who is a Crimean Tatar political leader, tells about the immediate aftermath of the illegal occupation. And um, he tells how President Putin called him up and made all sorts of promises that Dzhemiliev knew too much to accept as anything that would ever, you know, come to fruition. And So he rejected President Putin's offer to collaborate on this occupation of Crimea, and I think that this is an important story because Mustafa Jamiliev told President Putin that he had no basis whatsoever for even making that request, right? So I think that that really encapsulates to the extent to which there are two very different logics operating here that are important to how events unfold. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess the other thing that I would say about that is um, although there was not a lot of bloodshed when Russia initially occupied Crimea, it was nevertheless extremely traumatic. And as an anthropologist, I'm really interested in like the experiential dimensions of this,
Mm,
the phenomenological dimensions of like, well, what does it feel like when, to use the old Soviet expression, you fall asleep at night and you wake up in a different country without leaving the couch, right? Like
mm,
that famous expression. And it's psychologically traumatic, and people, lacking other, it was so traumatic that it was hard to talk about, and so people
mm,
use metaphors like um, one of the metaphors was that living there was like being in a bad dream that you couldn't wake up from, or going to, or like being in some sort of an asylum where everything is just so strange. Or another really common figure of speech was that it was like suddenly finding themselves in the Soviet Union. And there were markers for that, right? Like old Soviet medicine appeared on the shelves. The signage returned to Soviet signage, the typefaces, um, the music that you would hear on the streets, posters with Stalin on them, monuments to figures in Russian history. It was all almost like if you know the film The Truman Show, right, where it's like everything seems like it's fake. It's so unreal, you can't even take it on board at first.
and that seems very similar also to how their social media, approach has been, to basically cause as much confusion and as much, uh, back and forth as humanly possible so that it becomes impossible or, outright difficult to basically effectively communicate the truth. But, to circle towards, religion a little bit, you mention in the book that the Russian narrative tends to focus on the Christianization of the region. How has the Russian government kind of weaponized the legacy of religion, religious institutions like the Russian Orthodox Church against the Crimean Tatars and really Ukrainians at large?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the Russian authorities in Crimea have basically prohibited people who aren't um, who don't share their faith from exercising their freedom of religion. It's really that simple, right? So they made certain aspects of Islam. They banned certain aspects of Islam, so like certain texts could get you arrested, like completely things that were considered completely normal before. Nothing extremist, nothing with any like overtly political messaging. So that is what they have done, and of course, the opposite is true on the other side of those administrative boundary lines in government controlled Ukraine, where Ukrainian national identity has become so much more capacious because it's based on a civic identity as opposed to a ethnic, religious, or racial one.
So, and that kind of leads into my next question because you also mentioned that as the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars were beginning to resist, they started to see themselves differently than they had in the past. How has the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar relationship evolved since 2014? How did they previously see each other, and how has that impacted the larger war going forward?
Mhm. Yeah, so in Russian historiography, the relationship between the Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians is typically portrayed as adversarial. They were the arch enemies. Today, that history has been rewritten, and basically, one of the catalysts in this process was the people who were displaced from Russian occupied Crimea, who went to Ukraine, and that afforded them opportunities to get to know Ukrainians. And the Crimean Tatars were very present on the Revolutionary Square. And that also enabled Ukrainians to say, hey, like they share our values, they share aspects of our culture, they're committed to um, Ukraine, and over time they came to see their culture and their history as intertwined. And I think a really important catalyst in this process was um, grieving mutual losses that they experienced during the Soviet era. So I'm referring to the state organized famine, the Holodomor that was experienced all over Ukraine, including Crimea, as well as the 1944 deportation that I mentioned a little while ago. And so I think that political philosopher Judith Butler writes about how there's this really strong connection between um, grieving losses, recognizing the dignity of the other person, and forming political community. And I think that that's a really valuable way to think about what's happened in Ukraine, because the mutual grieving provided a basis for empathy. That empathy restored dignity where it had been absent before, and that provides the basis for collaborating on resisting Russian oppression together with um, their mutual values. Again, like I mentioned, like freedom, right? Not freedom, liberty, and the courage, right? Like those are the three ingredients: grieving mutual losses, embracing common values, and summoning the courage in the midst of a really, really difficult regime to resist.
And I think one of the things that I was interested in, especially, is that for a while there was, I think, this kind of not necessarily adverse relationship between the two groups, but there was this kind of skepticism that I think is finally being overcome. I just wish it wasn't under these horrible circumstances. But in the book, you also mentioned that sometimes Crimean Tatars have been described as being stuck between two hegemons in Ukraine and Russia. And how have they kind of overcome that narrative a little bit? And how have they also managed to see themselves within the larger Ukrainian national identity?
Yeah, so I think that that feeling of being stuck between two hegemons, like, sort of came from um, being a people who, like, as Indigenous, no matter where they turned, they were confronted with state power,
Mhm.
state structures. And I think that that's the key significance of indigeneity, indigenous identity, which is that it really provides a framework for counteracting historical human rights abuses structural violence, and power, right? It's like a mitigation strategy because we live in a state system. Like it's a system of territorial integrity. And so, but indigeneity fits in with that if we can recognize those rights. And I think that um, when it comes to the two hegemons feeling, the point at which that begins to dissipate is really after the occupation, when the Ukrainian administration recognizes the Crimean Tatars as indigenous. Russia has not done that. Recognizes the 1944 deportation as a genocide, sets up a permanent representative of the president to Crimea to oversee the human rights situation. And then finally, there's this body called Crimea Platform that is a place for high-level dialogue around, resolving all of the issues associated with the war on Ukraine as they pertain to Crimea. And so I think that um, although Ukraine really didn't have the wherewithal to protect Crimean Tatars very well in those first years of independence between, when Ukraine achieved its independence in 1991 and the occupation. Since the occupation, their activities have been really laudatory.
And I think that kind of leads into where the international community needs to respond. You mentioned how a lot of these Crimean Tatars have been downgraded in the international community from indigenous status to minority status. How can we, both people like you and me, commentating and warning about this, get that to change? How would that change impact the way in which Crimean Tatars are not just viewed within Ukraine, but also in their larger place in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of confusion about like what it even means to be indigenous and how that might be different from being just a regular minority. And I think that it's important to recognize that like as an indigenous people, they have an experience with prior statehood,
Hmm.
right? They had a state that lasted for over 350 years. Their language was the lingua franca, um, and continuous presence. And so like if you treat indigenous status as like a type of minority status, then that means that the indigenous people are basically the same as any other group. But the Crimean Tatars have no other homeland, right? They have prior statehood, and they have their own political institutions that they use to govern themselves, right? And so, what indigenous status does under the United Nations Declaration is just say that um, they have rights to self-determination. They have cultural rights to have support for speaking their language, practicing their culture and religion, and they should be afforded the opportunity to develop.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've been really frustrated by is how the larger discussion has been kind of influenced by this perspective of great power politics. Like part of the reason I haven't brought up the United States yet is because I really wanted to emphasize this point of there are people on the ground that experience this maltreatment. And Russia recently, they in their negotiations with Ukraine demanded that Ukraine make Russian the national language. How has Russia's attempts to erase the multi-ethnic history of the region influenced not just how Ukrainians have seen themselves, but also how Crimean Tatars live day to day under this occupation?
Mm. Well, I think it's another really powerful example of their like it's of like this epistemic violence of treating them as if they don't exist, as if they're
Mm.
actually Russian, as if they need to simply be more Russian. And so I think that it's another example. And um, inside of communities, inside of families, people continue to speak their native language and do what they can to keep their culture alive and operative.
And I think one of the things, and I mentioned just a second ago, how the perspective of the United States and Russia being the focus on everything is kind of unhelpful. But at the same time, I also do think having a discussion about how the United States and leaders around the world could help is really important. What could obviously the Trump administration isn't going to do much to help Ukrainians or Crimean Tatars at all, but what could a future president do to assist in maintaining the dignity and rights of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians? How can they push back on the narratives promoted by the Russian government, and more importantly, ensure that their lives are protected and guaranteed?
Mm-hmm. Well, how many hours do you have?
There's a long list. That was a good one.
Yeah. I think that in terms of examples, like um, Canada and New Zealand have done some very progressive things by ensuring Indigenous representation when they go to things like the climate talks, right? Or including encouraging cross-Indigenous cultural contacts. So for examples, that would be where I would look. But I think that what the United States can do is support international organizations like the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous People, like NATO, like all of there's so many consultative bodies. The EU is very involved in um, getting the wheels of transitional justice moving for Ukraine. And so I think that the United States can much better support the international community in supporting the rights of Ukrainians, including Crimean Tatars. And so in due course, I think really one of the major next steps is transitional justice, right? So accountability for the war crimes that have taken place, potentially truth commissions, leveraging already existing Ukrainian institutions of justice to push forward a transformation of Ukrainian society that supports its uniqueness and eventually reparations, right? Reparations for the losses that occurred in due course, right? I'm not saying tomorrow. I'm saying like over a long time span. These things are important. And so in the book, I talk about this idea of recognition, right? Like this sociocultural process whereby the pool of people that truly are considered significant expands. And I know that that has happened in Ukraine because they have, through this grieving, through common values, through courage, they have come to see the Crimean Tatars not as distant Orientalized others, but as Ukrainians, right? And recognition is a very important sociocultural process. So when I think about the United States, I think that there's sort of two pathways, both of which are important. On one hand, we have the sociocultural and sort of soft diplomacy approaches of that are symbolic, right? Like acknowledging past wrongs, um, treating people with the respect that they deserve, all of these sociocultural processes. And on the other side are structural changes, right? The structural changes that are required so that Ukraine can meaningfully defend itself, deter Russia from its uh, war of aggression and maintain their territorial boundaries so that they are free to develop. And so I think both of those things can happen ideally simultaneously. And there's just so many measures that could be taken.
And on the more strategic side, I know you mentioned supporting NATO is a really important component of ensuring not only that Ukraine has a future, but also really Europe has a peaceful future. But one of the arguments that has been presented by not necessarily pro Russian people, but sometimes people who are skeptical of United States intervention and really international institutions is that NATO expansion contributed to this war, to this act of aggression. And I was wondering, what were some of the responses that you received from the people on the ground when that kind of narrative came up? How would you respond to that? And how can we make sure that these institutions aren't being just straight up lied about?
Mm-hmm. Well, the people that I worked with talked about that narrative as um, like one of the sort of fake, the fake red lines that Russia extends, and basically um, they would say that like it's in Russian DNA to be aggressive. And I don't know if you remember a man named Salim in the book, but he talks about how Russia uses violence and Russia uses aggression because it's so weak. It's morally weak. And it should be viewed as such. Another person that another story that I share in the book is a man who um, referred to President Putin as being the emperor with no clothes,
Mm,
right? Like in the sense that um, there is a tendency to overestimate Russia and underestimate Ukraine. And
mhm.
if you think about like all of the efforts that Ukrainians have put towards defending themselves, I'm not sure Americans fully appreciate the depth of commitment that Ukrainians feel towards their country and one another, right? Like there's all of these ideas that they're just going to give up and and disappear, and I don't find that compelling, and I also don't find really any form of appeasement to be compelling. So, okay, say that NATO expansion hadn't occurred. Would that have changed Russia's desire? No. Then people said, oh well, if Russia can keep control over Crimea, then he won't make any further territorial incursions. The war will stop with Crimea. We don't want World War III. Let's see if he can just be appeased with Crimea. No, no, that didn't happen. Right? He just keeps going. So it's in the um, you know they have a expansionist um, they are operating under an expansionist logic and they do not respect territorial boundaries. So it doesn't really matter, like everything leading up to that. There is no appeasing this imperial appetite with like a little chunk of territory or a little agreement like we won't do this or we won't do that, right? I don't think that there's any appeasing Russian aggression. It has to be stopped.
It's one of the things where I feel like a lot of people don't learn from their history in terms of how we've seen people use almost like blood and soil rhetoric surrounding territorial expansion. Like Chamberlain said, "Oh, Hitler's not going to expand. He's not going to. We're just going to have this peace in our time," and then it completely fell apart. And this is the thing that where I look at it at NATO expansion, and people seem to have it mixed up. NATO expanded because of Russian aggression in the past. It did not lead to Russian aggression. But in terms of how Ukraine has attempted to seek a long term peace, what can be done to make sure that not only people understand that Ukraine's objective is not necessarily a perpetual war, but one that is a security guarantee? Because a lot of people talk about the very thing that you mentioned, this fear of World War III. How do we combat that kind of fear so that people can understand the long term goal for Ukraine and Crimean Tatars?
Hmm. You know, I think President Zelensky has been perfectly clear that Ukraine does not want other people's territory. They only want what is already legitimately theirs. And so I think it's actually like crystal clear that the only thing they are driving for is their own territorial integrity and their own autonomy. And I saw this very clearly at also a more sort of microcosmic level when I spoke to um, four four men who continue to live in occupied Crimea. I spoke to them when they were in the Ukrainian government controlled part of Ukraine. And basically, what they said to me was that they could see that this history was cyclic, right? Like there
Mm.
was these repeated dispossessions, these repeated ethnic cleansings, and they wanted to break the cycle of history so that they could enjoy, you know, future generations without this genocidal harm happening practically every generation. And they felt that, you know, they actually said the same thing that President Zelensky did before he said it. Actually, that we don't want anything. All we want is our ancestral land. Right? We're not out for Poland, Lithuania, the country of Georgia. Um, we just want what we already have, what we already legitimately have the rights to.
Yeah, and I remember one interview that Zelensky gave a while back where he was basically trying to make this point that you're talking about, that we want peace, we want an end to this war, but we will not give up our freedom to that effing terrorist Putin. But to kind of wrap up here, in terms of the United States' role with NATO, there's been talk of the United States pulling out of NATO, and if the United States were to pull out, what could some of the other European powers do to kind of assist Ukraine fill the gap that would be left by the United States isolationism, and how have people in Crimea and in Ukraine reacted to that possibility?
Well, people in Ukraine and Crimea and the Crimeans that are aware of it, of course, feel betrayed by the United States' inability to come forward with support for their defense in a more meaningful way. So there's that. But I think that, you know, Europe, to my way of thinking, the question is time, right? They already realize like how essential Ukrainian security is to the security of Europe as a whole. And so they're mobilizing resources. They are convening high level meetings to decide how to go about this. And I think, you know, a concern for me is that the war began with Crimea. And to my way of thinking, Ukraine will only be fully secure if Crimea can be returned to Ukrainian jurisdiction. And so here again, I'm not saying, you know, next week. These processes take time, energy, concerted effort. However, the a crucial thing to realize about Crimea is that it's basically a staging ground for other operations, right? And soon there will be, and so that is what I mean when I say that, you know, like for durable security, sustainable security for Ukraine, as well as the region, deoccupying Crimea is crucial. And so Ukraine has very detailed plans for executing this, difficult but not impossible, as do European countries. And I think that it's important for the United States to support those efforts.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining me, and I'm hoping that eventually we can actually have you back on in the future because this situation continues to be one of the most complex I've ever had to deal with or cover. But again, thank you very much for joining me. If there's any final remarks you'd like to make, now would be the time.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. And if people are interested in reading these stories, I think it's important to know that, like, all of the stories in the book are um, of like ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And it really is about the knitting together of Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians. It's the story of the last decade. The research begins in 2014, and it actually ends in 2023 with Crimean Tatar asylum seekers here in the United States. So if you're interested in that, you can get it anywhere books are sold. That's the cover right there. And or you can go to my website, which is my name followed by .com, and that will link you to previous interviews and my other work. And you can also like reach out to me directly. I will get an email if you have, like, I love hearing, which story was your favorite? Which chapter did you think was interesting for you? I love hearing that kind of feedback and engaging with people who um, uh, delve into the book itself.
Well, thank you very much again for joining me, and thank you to everybody who was listening. Really appreciate it. Have a nice day, everybody.